if you would like to sort of think of some pertinent questions, it's always better if you can ask questions necessarily than give statement. Kim, we've heard quite a lot, and David ended really with this idea of the right development in the right place. It comes out very much in the work of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. But what's fascinating, thinking about that and having been involved in some schemes, first, a lot of new development is undoubtedly not what people like, which is why they plant structure planting to hide it in the wrong place. So how do we address what is the right place if development is poor? And then secondly, we also know, or I know from the horse's mouth from Lord Taylor, that one of the reasons garden villages was being promoted is because a lot of land is optioned around settlements by volume house builders. So when you do urban extensions, a lot of the land's gone. So if you leapfrog that into the countryside, you've got more chance potentially of getting uplift in land value because it hadn't been spiked yet, so to speak. So with just those two issues maybe, and your excellent presentation, could you just give some thoughts about how one deals with this thorny issue of the right development in the right place?
It's not very fashionable, but I think we've lost sight of regional planning. So actually where in the country the development should happen, and maybe the push north should encourage more development in the north, is a starting point. Where we're going to grow our food is something that gets forgotten, but it's crucial. Agricultural land is not given any value in deciding where to put buildings anymore, so that's a pretty critical one. Where a development then sits in its landscape takes a lot of analysis, and I think one of the, if I dare say it, one of the problems with Poundbury is, as Ben said, it's on the top of a hill, and most settlements in the British Isles are actually down where the water is, and where the water flows tends to determine where the green spaces are, which is another reason why there's a problem with green space in Poundbury. So I think where regionally, where it's needed for employment, and actually that's one thing that Poundbury's brilliant about, but actually then how it sits within its settlement and how it works with topography and water and climate and food. I think those are the strategic things that need to be decided before any thought is given to the architecture itself.
I was at an event the other day on the Oxford to Cambridge Arc, and people were noting in the Q&A that this is one of the few examples of spatial planning in the country since the RSSs were destroyed. So, Andrew, if I may, or John, you mentioned, though, Andrew, when you were talking about this, the infrastructure and the risk attached to planning, one thing that's come out in the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission is this idea of the stewardship model. Is there a way to access, to make it easier for those people trying to do the right thing, taking a stewardship/legacy model to be able to get first dibs on that funding, if you like? Could you just sort of talk a little bit more about your challenges and how the government could help, perhaps, in that regard?
Yes, I mean, the challenge is quite straightforward. It's straightforward to describe, less so to solve. New standalone communities, as John mentioned earlier, don't get the advantage of riding on the back of infrastructure that's perhaps been funded and established many years before. Albeit the Torner Grain location was partly chosen to allow it to share infrastructure with neighbouring sort of employment opportunity allocations, and that has indeed been the case. So there's been a lot of infrastructure sharing, which has made it more efficient. But the big issue is getting a lot of that off the ground. If you've then had to fund it, then clearly that adds risk and extends out the period within which you're going to get a return from your project. And the difficulty that then arises, of course, is that there's a lot of pressure to do things to increase the rate of supply or to reduce the cost of investment in housing or something like that. So, to put it in short terms, you could reduce quality to try and help recover the investment that you've made in infrastructure. And that seems to me to be a pretty invidious situation to end up in. Now, I mean, in Scotland, the Scottish Government has various pots of money. It has a housing infrastructure fund, it has a building infrastructure fund. But there doesn't seem to be any great sense that when they've distributed those funds, they have targeted those funds at the type of development they want to see. It just goes to deliver housing without it being particularly discriminate about what that housing is. And as the government's in charge of those funds and wishes to see housing of the right type, well, it mystifies me that they don't use the power that they've got through that more than they do. I think it's frankly because they, from political perspective, they want more housing, and actually, certainly north of the border, they want that housing unrealistically cheaply if they want quality as well.
Yeah, it's a main issue, again, in the discussions with the Commission when we were talking about the disconnect, both at local level and at central government. It is quite extraordinary when infrastructure is such a major issue. The Department for Transport, DEFRA, and the Ministry of Housing don't actually have anybody that connects the three, for instance. So this idea of a placemaking champion, both in the cabinet, for instance, they're going to actually look at the connection, join the dots, if you like, is one recommendation. Ben Murphy, can I just ask you, because if you build on that, yeah.
Government funding has come with no strings attached. It's absolutely incredible. This idea that it's all been about accelerated delivery. And the other thing is the allocation levels. So Sittingbourne, a 10,000 home allocation is being considered because it will help pay for the new junction. So it is a numbers game in so many ways. It's both in terms of housing need, but also as a means to fund infrastructure. And it's quite shocking. And I think I find it incredible that you would not have strings attached to that level of low-cost loans, because the low-cost loans are needed, and they absolutely are. The large-site infrastructure loans are there, and they're very much been taken by the volume house builders. But as I say, it's all about delivery, and that's been the pressure for the last few years. And in terms of locations, all the best locations have gone. I mean, Nansledden is on top of a hill. It's another windy site, because people were sensible in terms of choosing where they settled back. And I think you have to provide the homes where there is the need for the homes. So successful governments previously have made mistakes of trying to build up north without necessarily levelling up. So, there hasn't been the demand. So the allocation sits there without being delivered out. So you do need to meet demand and stop those towns choking. But how you do that with the green belt is obviously another challenge.
Ben Pentreath and maybe also David, in relation to having to deal with different sides of the same coin. Do you think well-designed places are more popular?
Yes.
David. We've certainly found that in our 15, 20 years of working. And I think back to your point specifically, actually, maybe on subjective versus objective, that was one of the key discussions that's been had, is for years or for decades, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, is the thing that everyone believes in. But it's funny how much consensus you can get between people as to what's beautiful or not. And in fashion you have that. I'm sure in the landscapes you sit 1,000 people together and give them options and say what's the most beautiful. People don't tend to have a problem at all. You're never going to get everyone to agree, of course. But the idea that nobody can agree. So I think that's the point, is that what one doesn't want to do, and this is the danger perhaps with this national design code or even a local design code, is assume that the 60% of people who agree, then you're going to get 100% of that. I think what we find, and it's particularly important in some of the places, there's clearly not total agreement between, as Ben was saying, Poundbury is very diverse, and he's been part of that. He's now looking at development that's more uniform because it's maybe more representative of the way it's been delivered. But I think, when you engage a community with visual preference surveys, where they're looking at landscape types, it's relatively simple. You'll get 60 to 70% of people who like the very elegant ordinary. You'll get 15%, 20 people who love the contemporary, and you'll get 10 people who are beauty blind, which is also fine. So does anybody sort of want to respond to this idea of democracy and beauty, if you like?
I would like to, I think it's interesting to me locally. 15 years ago, when I sort of first moved back down to Dorchester born and bred, Poundbury, you chose your words carefully. If somebody said to you in a social situation, what do you do, or I'm an architect, what are you working on, I really used to choose my words carefully because I got sick and tired of the bloody dinner party conversation about Poundbury and how everyone hated it. And people from all backgrounds, taxi drivers, posh people in nice old vicarages, etc. I detect that, personally, I detect that in the last 3 years, 4 years, maybe 5, but really quite recently, I feel that there has been a significant change in local public attitude to Poundbury. It's now just about safe for Ben and I to invite people down from London, give them the spiel in Poundbury, and to send them in a taxi back to Dorchester Station, which used to be absolutely toxic because they would say, "Oh, we've just been to Poundbury, they'd ask the taxi driver what they think, and they would mouth off. And the last 10 minutes of that person's whole day was listening to...
I nearly invited the taxi drivers to the last royal visit.
Yeah. But the other day I was in a taxi going from Dorchester to Exeter. It was quite a long journey, and I had the benefit of many views of that particular taxi driver, who was quite loquacious on all sorts of subjects, from the Prime Minister down. And without any prompting, he told me his views on Poundbury, as they often do, and it was generally very complimentary. And I think the shift has occurred because people now see in action the full reality of Leon's master plan, which is not just big buildings, but is actually the statistics which Ben was showing in his slideshow. And that's what I get back to about, it's not really a question just of aesthetics. It's not really a question of what the buildings look like. That is hard for all sorts of people to agree on, actually. And you can sometimes end up with the least offensive thing not being the right thing. But I do think that the form of development that Poundbury, if you can strip away the architecture for a moment, everyone understands the need to be able to walk to work. And we have structured settlements in a way for, 60 years where that is impossible. It's impossible to take your kids to school without getting in a car. It's impossible to go shopping without getting in a car. And, that slide I think I showed of China congestion, well, we've got the same issue in Dorchester and in Blandford, at rush hour, every morning and every evening. People really understand it. So I think that side is incredibly popular, and that's really what people want.
Yeah, and just very briefly, John, if I may, before going to the floor, you spoke very passionately about what it meant to you as a landowner to see that moment, having taken years, if not decades, to get to a point when you see the party in the community and the shop opening, I think, was it last week or this week even, these little increments of community that, again, sorry to keep referring to the Commission, but it is something the government's quite focused on at the moment, as we know. But when they went on the site visits, before the site visits, everyone were throwing their hat in the ring. Go and visit this, it's brilliant, go and visit that. The minute they realised that 20 people would go and visit it, all of the names dried up. And there's a sort of abstraction out there in the world between all these brilliant mythical places that somehow don't actually quite exist. When they then went to these places and came back, and that was when Sir Roger was still at the helm in the early days, they said, you know what's funny, and this was before they visited or came down informally to Poundbury, is that out of all the places we had, the centres didn't exist. And actually, it's like you said, Ben, they very quickly come to the conclusion that this notion of beauty was not the facade of a single building. It was this sense of the community and its relationship to the landscape, or a landmark like a local church they spoke very highly of. Could you just say, from your experience perhaps of watching a new community in a field, if you like, so it's quite isolated to one degree, so it's a pioneering effort in a way that we haven't really seen in this country for maybe 100 odd years, with the exception of Milton Keynes or the Garden Villages. What does it feel like, and how much do you rate the quality of the master plan and the quality of the architecture in enabling that sense of community, if you like? Why doesn't a community? Surely communities can exist in suburbs, I guess, is my question.
Really interesting. I'm finding it quite hard to get my finger on. Something at Torner Green has gone very right. I don't really take much credit for it, but we've been really overwhelmed by local people responding to it in a positive way. We look very closely at the local Facebook. We know quite a lot of members of the community, and in our engagements with them and with the local authority and with the council. I was always worried that it would be considered historicist or pastiche, or that hasn't happened at all. And the community already has a real sense of ownership over it. The local authority has a sense of ownership over it and is lauded for its vision by other Scottish local authorities. So I can't quite. Something is whether it's the fact that it is a standalone community, so it doesn't have an us and them situation with a pre-existing settlement, or whether it's. I just can't quite put my finger on it. But it's been very, very gratifying that the way it's been received. Having said that, we've had very little media coverage of it, particularly in Scotland. All the local authorities seem to know about it, and the Highlands are buzzing about it. The local community are very proud of it already, but hardly any journalists have been. It's been in hardly any publications.
I was just going to add to that. I think it is popular development, and the fact that the press haven't, it means the public allowed to speak. I don't, mean to be self-flagellating about Poundbury at all, or indeed to try and defend it. But in the sense that it is popular development, and people, and I'm very careful about that because of the affordability issue. But it's had a premium since the start. The people that live there love it. People understand it. Who try to understand it love it. But actually, it was never given a chance. When you look back, it was almost a naivety of the Duchy and His Royal Highness, which was basically, slating the architectural profession, the planning profession, the house builders, and then saying we're going to try and do better. And it was a very instant. And of course, that's just saying, well, we're waiting to trip you up then. And I think that sort of that. But if you take that aside, I mean, Nan's Levin, the local people are buzzing about it, and maybe we're better at managing that message and engaging with people locally. But I think that's telling that the press haven't really got involved; they just allowed you to be.
Kim, yes.
The most convincing thing about your whole presentation was the logic with which you located the whole development rather than three separate ones, the way you placed it very sensibly on the right land between Nairn and Inverness. And that, everything flowed from that. And so, Ben, I think your mischievous question to the other Ben about would good design be popular, of course it would. But it's not enough. And the Commission started from a basis of, if we do popular, pretty design, we won't have any objections to development. And it's the wrong place to start. You need to start with the right place, absolutely logically, and then everything flows out from that.
People are more intelligent than that.
Yeah, it's patronising to think that...
It's intuitive. It's like movement networks.
Shop.
If you don't have a route that makes sense from a place to another place, and it's a weird cul-de-sac off a main road, it never feels like a real place.
Yeah. I do not imagine that Dorset Council are going to ask you to go to a beauty consultant.
Me.
George. Yes. We are addressing all of the things. I'm still not looking at beauty. I'm still looking at the phrasing. I want things to be in keeping with what we've got. I don't think beauty fits because I don't think it's totally beautiful that it's fitting in with. It's in the keeping of what we have in Dorset. And we have such a fantastic, such a standalone area, I feel, that things should be fitting in with that. And through your environmental impact assessment, that will be dealing with that. So no, you don't have to go to a beauty consultant.
We definitely do believe that much more new housing needs to be built in this country and in Dorset in particular. And there are a number of problems with the kind of housing we're getting at the moment. We're not getting the right type of housing. We're not getting sufficient social housing. The government's definition of affordable housing is highly questionable. It doesn't relate to the need on the ground in places like Dorset or in much of England for that matter. So changes are needed there. And precisely the reason why we're getting more involved in design and we're holding events like this is because we know that not all the new housing we need can go on brownfield sites. There is enough brownfield land for 1 million new homes, yes, but that's not going to be enough. We're going to need to build more new houses than that. And the question is, how do we do it in a way that's respectful of the wider context, but also helps us to adapt to climate change as well, because the other problem we highlighted in the housing audit is that a lot of the new housing that's being built is failing even basic energy performance certificate standards. And this is completely the opposite direction where we were supposed to be going when we had the Code for Sustainable Homes, which George Osborne abolished in 2015, I think it was. Robert Jenrick said he's going to bring in a future home standard. That's welcome from 2025, but need it the sooner the better. And we do need to be seeing the kind of housing that's been highlighted in the presentations today as a norm, not just as the exception.
Yeah, and just on that, Blenheim's quite an interesting example we've heard from recently, because they've got quite a few staff working in events who don't get paid massively. Prices in Oxfordshire are horrendous, so they're actually delivering all their own affordable housing, a lot of it at 60% discount to open market, because that's actually on the verge of affordable. So I think under a right stewardship model, there are ways to actually do things properly.
But that's going back to what you were talking about, democracy. Now, the people from Sherborne should be designing the development in Sherborne. Now, in Gillingham, my town, when we have the southern extension, the community master planned that southern extension. It's their development. They have to live there. They have to take ownership of this. And so it's the community that should be working with us and looking at all the infrastructure and all the things that we want to come forward with the housing. It can't just come forward as housing. I mean, granted, in Sherborne, it's seen as a sustainable town. And first of all, in the local plans, development will go to sustainable areas, to the towns, rather than the villages. And so it will go to Sherborne, but you will have a chance to help design this, all the community. And that's the whole thing I'm trying to talk about, is this shouldn't be something that's done to the community, it's done with the community. Now, that might just sound like some headline, but it's really serious. You're going to be there. The democracy part of this is that we have to have not just development in Dorset, but we need a happy Dorset. We need the community happy to live there. Or why would they? They need to take ownership. It's got to be a whole community project, all of this development in Dorset. It's not just something the council's going to do to you or a developer's going to do to you. Let's all try and do something good for Dorset. Sherborne got a neighbourhood plan?
No, I was just saying they should have.
Yes,
I don't know.
but that won't be coming in time now. But yeah, you make recommendations on your town council, but those things are all taken seriously by the area boards. And I mean, I go to 4 area boards, and they take everything very seriously. People come and speak. That's the whole point of democracy. Your members can come and speak at the planning committee and put your views across. And I can assure you that the committee will listen.
Persimmon, I mean, I'm not going to single out a single housing board completely, but I mean, I genuinely believe that companies have cultures within them. And if those cultures propagate for long enough, they become very strong. And in Phil Fry's company, there's a very strong culture which understands good design. I mean, we've got to the point in Poundbury or Mansledden development, George and I can trust Philip and his team of people, many of whom have been in that company for a long time, to deliver the sort of things which we're talking about with very little intervention from me. Sometimes my role with Philip is to persuade him to do more of the same thing rather than more variety. You know, that's quite an extraordinary position to be in. I've only had one personal direct involvement with Persimmon in South Wales, getting on for 15 years ago now. In those days, they were prepared to pay a design fee of, I believe it was £50 per dwelling. When they presented their standard house types, it became clear that I could change nothing. I couldn't change anything about that standard house type without being faced with a room of people telling me, you know, to shut up. And so at a certain point, quite quickly, I realised that they speak one language, I speak a different language. We're all going to be happier if we don't talk to each other. So they don't have a culture which anywhere embedded in that company, as far as I can see in my limited engagement with them over the years, where the sort of things that we've been talking about are possible. In fact, they sort of delight in saying, this is not possible. They actually take pleasure from that. And no doubt the boss of Persimmon equally takes pleasure in his not just multi-million, but multi-tens of millions of pounds annual bonus each year, because they are a business entirely focused on taking the margin between the lowest possible build cost for the price that they can get. And we all know, developers in this room and others who are not here, will not go to a site where Persimmon is building next door on a large scale, because they know that Persimmon will undercut their house prices to get those guys away. They don't want any competition near them. I mean, they are absolutely ruthless.
We're looking at it from the wrong thing. I don't think we want a carrot, we want a stick. And that stick's got to come through the white paper. No, when I was supposed to review the previous paper at TCPA, we were hoping there was going to be something in there where you could use a developer's history with the planning application. If they had a bad history, you could use that against them. If they had a good history, you could use that for them and speed things up. So government have got to give us some powers to stop this bad development. Persimmons are not going to build carbon neutral houses until they're told to by government. So government's got to grow a pair and tell them.
Yes, Paul.
Yeah, I just very much like to echo what David said there, and I'm sure people here today will remember who the former MP for this area was before the general election, a certain Sir Oliver Letwin, and he produced a really good report a couple of years ago about a review of build-out. And although the government has been very tardy in taking forward the recommendations of that review of build-out, we do understand from officials that they are still looking at some of the recommendations that Sir Oliver made. And so that, just to add to what David said, I think there's still a lot of scope to put pressure on government to get these reforms in, so that developers are put under more pressure to deliver good quality and are being shamed when they're delivering poor quality.
Yeah. People come to us after the occasion and regret selling to Persimmon, but you just think, well, what were you thinking? You obviously just went with the highest bidder. It's just the short-sightedness. But between the two, land controls and planning policy, you have both carrot and stick.
Just quick, just wind back a bit to some of the things that David said in relation to some of what we've been doing at Torna Grain and the problems with Sherburn and expanding existing towns. Have you considered the thought of going something like the Torna Grain route and starting on a greenfield site, maybe picking 2 or 3 greenfield sites for new towns of 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people? Because we're talking about communities taking ownership of these new developments. Well, with a greenfield site, without any legacy issues, without any contiguous communities, they do seem to take ownership of it. And I was wondering if you've considered that possibly for Dorset.
We have actually asked officers to go away and do a piece of work on where it would be possible to have such new developments. So we are looking at that.
Ben, do you want to comment on the short-term investment cycle or poor quality?
The question about building fabric, I mean, of course, there are some funny things which come into play. I remember 5 years I worked in the States, and in New York, in the mid-19th century, there was the most fantastic shortage of wood. America was expanding at a rate that no one had ever seen anything like. All of the houses were basically built of wood, even in New York, where they're then faced in brick. And in many of the townhouses that we were doing up, helping people to do up, 150-year-old houses, you would find a length of wood no longer than that being gang-nailed together. The quality of construction was shocking. You find the same thing in Georgian houses in Bath or Liverpool or London. They're very cheaply, badly built houses, actually. And today, if you start getting into reconstructing a Georgian house, you will find that there are many construction flaws. Victorian houses tend to be very well built in England, and Edwardian houses are particularly well built. Why do we like Georgian houses? Why do we feel that they're long-lasting? There is an essential beauty to them that makes them worth restoring and repairing and looking after. The flip side of it is that I think in some ways today, right now, I actually believe, like certainly on some of the sites we're working on, Phillips sites or whatever it might be, that construction levels are actually reasonably high compared to even 20 or 30 years ago when I first started out in the world of building. But the issue which we have now is that building systems are incredibly complex. And when you look at the kind of outside face of the brick and the inside face of the plaster, In a Georgian house, there was brick and then there was plaster, with two materials. Now, in a given wall of a given thickness, there might be 20 to 30 different products, many of which are plastic, in order to keep in heat as well as to keep out the weather. And we're building buildings that are very difficult to change or amend. They're very unhackable. They're very unrobust. And we've sort of got into the system where all of the buildings that we're building in Poundbury or anywhere else are sort of actually facades on top of very complicated washing machines, plastic buildings. And I do worry, even in Poundbury, in 30 to 40 to 50 years' time, we know that a lot of the systems which are being used today to build those houses will be redundant. And it is a real worry with buildings like this one.
May I just say thank you, Emma, thank you, Peter, thank you to the CPRE for putting this all together. I think you can tell from the quality and the passion of the speakers that this is not a day job. I think, Emma, you talked to one of the of what John and Andrew are doing as heroic, and I think we need more heroism in the wider sense of the world where everyone's working together to make the best places they can. So, thank you.